Right after you say something, your eyes move to the other person's face, almost immediately. It happens so quickly that most people don't notice it happening. A sentence leaves your mouth, and before the moment fully settles, your attention shifts toward the person who heard it, not dramatically. Not like you're openly waiting for approval, just a small movement of attention. A glance, a quick observation. Something inside your mind wants to see what happened the moment your words landed. You might not consciously think about it. In fact, if someone asked whether you do this, you might say no, or you might say you're just paying attention. Just being observant. But if you start noticing your own reactions during conversations, you may realize the pattern appears more often than expected. You speak. And then, almost automatically, you check. You notice the other person's eyes. You notice their mouth. You notice whether their expression changes slightly after hearing what you said. Sometimes the reaction is immediate. A nod. A smile. A quick response. And in those moments, the brain relaxes almost instantly. The conversation continues normally. Nothing about. The moment feels unusual. But sometimes, the reaction is delayed, not dramatically delayed. Just a fraction of a second. A pause that is barely noticeable. And in that small space, something interesting begins to happen inside the mind. Attention sharpens. Your brain starts observing more carefully. Did they hesitate? Was that pause normal? Did their expression change? Did the tone of the conversation shift slightly? None of this usually feels stressful. Most of the time it happens quietly, beneath awareness. But the observation is still there. And once you start noticing it, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore, because it appears in many everyday situations. You share an idea during a meeting. The moment you finish speaking, your attention briefly scans the room. Not in an obvious way, just enough to see how people reacted. You might notice someone nodding, someone looking thoughtful, someone glancing at another person, or sometimes someone remaining completely neutral. And that neutral reaction can feel strangely ambiguous. A neutral face can mean many things. It could mean agreement. It could mean disagreement. It could mean the person simply didn't have a reaction at all. But the brain rarely assumes the last option immediately. Instead, it continues observing. Just for a moment longer. Just long enough to see whether something becomes clearer. The same thing happens in casual conversations. You tell a story to a friend. While the final words are leaving your mouth, your attention moves toward their face. Not because you're expecting praise. Not because you're obviously looking for validation. The reaction you're looking for is much more subtle than that. You're looking for signals that the moment stayed stable, that nothing in the interaction suddenly changed, that the atmosphere between two people remained safe. Most conversations feel predictable. People speak. People respond. The flow continues naturally. But every spoken sentence carries a small uncertainty. Once words leave your mouth, you no longer control how they will be interpreted. The other person may understand exactly what you meant, or they may interpret it slightly differently. Tone can be misunderstood. Intent can be misread. A harmless comment can land in an unexpected way depending on context, mood, or timing. And if that happens, the first signal rarely appears in words. Words take time. Facial expressions appear instantly, a slight tightening around the mouth, a brief narrowing of the eyes, a pause that lasts half a second longer than expected. These are small signals. Signals that many people barely notice. But for someone who has developed sensitivity to them, they stand out clearly. So the brain learns something simple. Speak, then check. And the checking becomes extremely fast. Fast enough that it stops feeling like a conscious decision. It feels like a reflex. The moment a sentence ends, the brain briefly scans for confirmation that the social environment stayed stable. Did anything change? Did the atmosphere shift? Did the person react in a way that suggests tension? Most of the time, the answer is no. Everything appears normal. The other person responds casually. The conversation continues. But the monitoring system still performs its check. Because once the brain learns that facial expressions reveal emotional signals quickly, it begins treating those signals as valuable information. And valuable information tends to attract attention, especially when it appears in the exact moment when uncertainty is highest. That moment exists right after you speak, before the other person responds, before the conversation moves forward, before words clarify what the reaction means. In that small window of time, facial expressions are often the only clues available, and the brain becomes very good at reading them. You might notice the other person's eyes moving slightly. You might notice whether their expression remains relaxed. You might notice if their posture shifts subtly. None of this requires effort. It happens quickly, almost automatically. Your attention simply moves toward the signals. Then the moment passes. The conversation continues. But the pattern repeats again the next time you speak. Speak, check, interpret, continue. Over time, this sequence becomes so familiar that it blends into the background of social interaction. You might not remember the first moment it started. It simply feels like part of how conversations work. You say something, and your attention briefly moves toward the other person's reaction. Just enough to understand what happened in the moment after your words landed. For many people, this feels like simple social awareness. Just being attentive. Just reading the room, just noticing how people respond. And on the surface, that explanation seems reasonable. After all, humans constantly read facial expressions during conversations. Understanding reactions helps guide social behavior. It helps people know when to continue speaking, when to clarify something, when to shift the topic. So noticing reactions is completely normal. But in this specific pattern, something slightly different is happening. Because the observation appears with a very specific timing, it happens immediately after you speak, not randomly, not occasionally, almost every time your words leave your mouth. That timing suggests the brain is not simply observing people. It is verifying something. A small internal question appears right after each sentence. Did that change anything? Most people wait for words to answer that question. But words take time. Facial expressions arrive first. The smallest emotional signals appear before anyone says anything. And someone who becomes sensitive to those signals learns to read them quickly. Their attention locks onto the other person's face for a brief moment. Then the brain forms a rapid interpretation. Everything looks normal, or something feels uncertain. And then the conversation continues. The strange part is that many people who do this rarely realize how often it happens, because the behavior feels natural. Just part of paying attention during a conversation. But once someone starts observing their own reactions, the pattern becomes easier to notice. You say something. Your eyes move toward the other person's face. You briefly evaluate their expression. Then you continue speaking. It can happen dozens of times in a single conversation. And it rarely feels like effort. It feels automatic. Psychologists sometimes describe this pattern as a form of rejection anticipation. A quiet system where the brain monitors social interactions for early signs of negative reactions. Not in a dramatic way, in a subtle way. The mind treats every spoken sentence as a small social risk. Most of the time that risk is tiny, almost invisible. But the possibility still exists. Something you say might land differently than intended. Someone might misinterpret your tone. A comment might unintentionally create tension. And if that happens, the first signal usually appears in facial expressions, not in words. So the brain creates a fast feedback loop. Speak, scan, evaluate. If the other person's expression stays relaxed, the brain registers the interaction as safe. If the signal is unclear, attention lingers a little longer. And this is where the monitoring system becomes interesting. Because many of the reactions being monitored were never negative to begin with. A neutral face might simply mean the person is thinking. A pause might mean they are choosing their words. A glance away might have nothing to do with what you said. But when the brain becomes trained to search for signals of rejection, neutrality can feel ambiguous. And ambiguity keeps attention active. So the system continues scanning, just in case. Patterns like this rarely appear randomly. The brain does not develop constant social monitoring without a reason. In many cases in life, in environments where emotional signals mattered more than direct communication. Situations where reactions were not always predictable. Someone could sound calm but suddenly become irritated. A conversation could feel normal one moment and tense the next. A small comment might unexpectedly shift the mood in a room. In environments like that, facial expressions become extremely valuable sources of information. Long before someone says anything directly, their face often reveals the first sign that something changed, a tightening around the mouth, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a pause that feels slightly longer than usual. For a child or teenager growing up in that kind of atmosphere, noticing those signals becomes useful very quickly. Not as a conscious strategy, as an adaptation. The brain begins to understand that emotional shifts rarely arrive with clear warnings. They appear in subtle signals first. And if those signals are detected early enough, behavior can adjust before the situation escalates. So attention becomes trained toward reactions, gradually, quietly. The mind begins paying closer attention to faces, tones of voice, pauses in conversation. Over time, the sensitivity becomes sharper. Eventually, the pattern becomes automatic. Even in calm environments. Even in conversations where nothing threatening is happening. Because once a monitoring system proves useful, the brain rarely shuts it off completely. It continues, running in the background. And this is where the behavior often appears today. Not in unpredictable environments, but in completely ordinary interactions. A conversation with a friend, a comment during a meeting, a simple opinion shared during dinner. Yet the brain still behaves as if emotional signals must be checked immediately. So the moment a sentence leaves your mouth, your attention moves to the other person's face. Not because something is wrong, but because the brain learned long ago that facial expressions reveal the earliest signs of social tension. And once the brain learns that lesson, it rarely forgets it. Over time, this small habit begins shaping the way conversations feel internally. From the outside, nothing looks unusual. You speak normally. You participate in conversations like anyone else. No one around you notices anything different. But internally, something subtle is happening. Every time you speak, there is a brief moment where your attention leaves the conversation itself and moves toward evaluation. The brain checks whether the reaction you see matches what you expected. If the expression looks relaxed, the mind settles quickly. If the signal is unclear, attention lingers slightly longer, not because the conversation is actually tense, because uncertainty feels unfinished, and the brain prefers resolution. So it keeps observing, sometimes only for a second, sometimes quietly across the rest of the interaction. You might find yourself paying closer attention to tone, to posture, to small expressions that appear later in the conversation. Not intentionally, just automatically. The strange part is that the system rarely stops completely. Because once the brain learns to monitor social safety through reactions, it begins treating that safety as something that must be confirmed repeatedly. Not once, but every time you speak, check, interpret, continue, and behaviors like this rarely exist alone. The same mind that quietly reads expressions after speaking often notices something else as well. The smallest shifts in someone's tone,